And so to get the conversation started today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Holcomb, who is a senior postdoctoral research associate at the Pulias Center for Higher Education at the University of Southern California. Dr. Holcomb is an author, researcher on the recent study titled Shared Equity Leadership, Making Equity Everyone's Work. Once again, thank you so very much for joining us today. And we are thrilled that Dr. Holcomb is available and willing to share her insights with us from her ongoing work. So Dr. Holcomb, I'll pass it on to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, President Rodriguez. It's really nice to be here today. And thank you everyone for having me here to talk about shared equity leadership. I'm really honored to share our work with a group of people who are experts in DEI and passionate about the work, and to learn from you all over the course of this convening as well. And thanks to Taffy for inviting me and for serving on our project's advisory board. So today I'm going to talk about a research project that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of for the past 2.5 years. It's a partnership between USC's Pulias Center for Higher Education and the American Council on Education that we started at the very end of 2019. So a different world in many ways. I've been working with Adriana Kizar from USC, as well as a team of doctoral students, including Jude Paul Dizan, Jordan Harper, and Natsumi Ueda, as well as partnering with Darcella V. Heel from ACE. And we've had funding from the Sloan Foundation and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation to do this work over 2 phases of data collection, one in 2020 and one in 2021. And just those years, you know that I'm going to have a lot of things to say about the timeliness of when we were doing this data collection later on in my talk. So our research really evolved out of prior work that Adriana did with Sharon Fries-Britt on leadership in times of racial crisis at the University of Missouri, as well as work that Adriana and I have done on shared leadership. It's really looking at the intersection of those two and grounded in the broader research on shared leadership, which can be applied to all sorts of complex challenges and issues. We also leaned on the work of Estella Ben-Simon and Alicia Dowd on equity-mindedness and equity-minded leadership. And we're building upon the work of Damon Williams and Katrina Wade Golden on strategic diversity leadership and their chief diversity officer study as well. So dropping all those names just really to show that this is influenced by so much of what's come before and the expertise of many different scholars, as well as what we were hearing from our informal conversations with leaders across the country about trying out more shared or collaborative approaches to equity leadership. So we conducted a multiple case study of shared leadership for diversity, equity, and inclusion at 8 institutions across the country. These included PWIs and MSIs, community colleges and research universities, public and private, almost every region across the country. So we intentionally tried to get kind of a cross-section of institutional types and characteristics. And we picked the institutions to participate based on finding places that were making strides in terms of achieving their equity goals, but also doing it in a way that is intentionally collaborative and shared. The study was primarily interview-based, so we interviewed over 100 leaders, ranging from presidents and provosts to student affairs leaders, faculty, facilities, fundraising, community engagement, finance, and business, really spanning the gamut of higher education roles, to learn about how these individuals were involved in equity leadership and how they work together collectively to accomplish their equity goals. So that's some background on the study. And now I'm going to talk about what is shared equity leadership. And I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see this visual of our model here. All right, there we go. I think this will be helpful as I'm talking through it. So we found that shared equity leadership has 3 major elements. I'm going to briefly touch on each of them, and then I'll go into depth about each of these 3 areas. So first, in the center of the circle here, is this notion that leaders doing this work need to be personally engaged in and committed to the work and continually learning and growing their critical consciousness. So we call this leader's personal journey. Second, in this middle ring here, is a set of values that are shared among members of the leadership team or group, which animate and guide the work. And third, a set of practices that leaders are continuously enacting that enable them to share leadership to create more just and equitable conditions on their campuses. And we further categorize the practices into 5 sets of related practices. So the category names are in the circle, and then we have the chart that details all the individual practices. So now I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So first, the personal journey toward critical consciousness is this notion that individuals have to do their own work. Before leaders can really look externally and effectively contribute to transforming their institutions, they first have to look inward and think about themselves, undergo a journey of introspection that helps them develop or refine their critical consciousness. And it's really an ongoing process. That's why we call it a journey. And in the report, we talk about different entry points or different ways that people sort of embarked on their personal journeys or continued on their personal journeys. And I can't get into all the details of that here just for the sake of time. But what I thought was interesting about that is that there's a place for everyone in the work. So shared equity leadership can include leaders from a variety of different identities, backgrounds, and experiences, as long as that personal commitment to the work, to ongoing reflection and engagement, thinking about your own identity and your place within kind of the larger systems and structures of inequity is happening. So second is the set of values that leaders embody collectively. And values are the beliefs and ideals that matter to individuals or groups. The values of shared equity leadership we found are developed through leaders' personal experiences and commitments to equity, and then they're cultivated and nurtured in the collaborative work that they do with one another. So some values in the model, like courage or creativity and innovation, might be more familiar from traditional Western or individualistic models of leadership or leadership development. But many of them are not, especially ones like love and care or vulnerability or comfort with being uncomfortable. But these are all values that emerged as really important for guiding the work. And third is a set of practices that leaders are continuously enacting together. And practices are the ongoing regular activities that leaders are performing individually and collectively in order to accomplish their equity goals. So we found 16 of them, further categorized into 5 sets of related practices, with this foundational practice up here in gray of centering the needs of systemically disadvantaged groups, kind of underlying the other ones. So I know that that's a lot, and I want to emphasize that groups or individuals engaged in this work don't necessarily need to perform each and every one of these practices, but rather can lean into their strengths in different areas. So I'll share one example that I think exemplifies this well. So disrupting is a practice that I think exemplifies this by showing how a particular practice doesn't necessarily have to be enacted by everyone in order for the model to be effective. So many teams that we studied had members who intentionally disrupted traditional norms or ways of thinking and operating to point out inequities and problems, whether bringing their own lived experiences to the table or students' experiences. And this was super important, but every team member could not be a disruptor. If everyone was disrupting all the time, nothing would ever get done. But it was so crucial to have someone or a couple of people even enacting this practice, maybe not the same person all the time, maybe different people at different times, but just so these important issues are getting surfaced and the status quo isn't being perpetuated. And we're actually working on a report now. I was just in a meeting talking about it, that will look at how people in different roles across the institution might be particularly well positioned to lean into specific values or practices, either by virtue of their functional area or their position in the organizational hierarchy. So more to come on that later this year. I do just want to emphasize again that every leader doesn't need to embody every value in every practice, that it's a menu of options rather than a set of requirements. I don't know very many people who would be really good at doing all of these things all the time. Maybe there's a few out there, but the benefit of the collective or shared approach to leadership is that different people on the team or in the group can lean into their strengths in different areas and step back or forward at different times. And there's really, that's really the importance of having a critical mass of people who are on their personal journeys doing this work together. I also want to emphasize that we think about this as a process. And sometimes we get a little bit of confusion about this based on the graphic. We're not the strongest in graphic design, but these are not static and separate elements or a checklist or something linear with discrete steps, one to the next to the next. It's all connected and it interacts in a mutually reinforcing way. So values inform practices, which inform personal journey, and in the other direction as well. So I want to acknowledge a question or a concern that we get when we talk about this work, that this approach could turn into it's everyone's work, but really it's no one's work, kind of a way to deprioritize equity work while paying lip service to collaboration and inclusion. or that it's a way to somehow save money by not hiring executive level DEI professionals and instead distributing the work among people who are already overworked and overwhelmed and overburdened. And I just want to say no, that is not at all how this work is intended or how it should be interpreted. We're currently analyzing data on what accountability and responsibility look like in these shared equity leadership environments. Campuses have been experimenting with a variety of ways to ensure that the work is actually getting done as it's being shared more broadly, and that it's being distributed fairly and rewarded accordingly. And also, we've just been reflecting on what accountability means when so much of what we're talking about is people's felt experiences of inclusion, of belonging, of safety. So we're exploring a lot of these issues now, and these are things that our research participants brought up as well. Also, this isn't necessarily a cheaper way to do this work at all. Many of the structures we studied do have a CDO or other executive level DEI position. Most of them actually do. But even the few that don't have many structures in place to organize the work and substantial resources dedicated to ensuring the work is getting done. I also don't want to give the impression that it's prohibitively expensive. Rather, it's just a way of reprioritizing and reallocating funding and rethinking the way that resources are allocated, whether it's human, financial, or otherwise. And I also want to emphasize that the work is not intended to disempower CDOs or suggest that the work of a chief diversity officer is not important. Instead, it's about positioning leaders within a network of support, building capacity and building relationships across campus. There's just so much to do across all aspects of the institution when we're thinking about the structural and systemic changes that we need to make. And a single leader alone can't do this alone. So having committed partners and empowered change agents at the local level across the institution, in addition to just the top level, really can drive change at multiple levels across the organization. So I wanted to transition to just sharing a couple of insights we gleaned based on the time we were conducting this research. So I mentioned we started this right as COVID was coming to the US. I think our first interviews were in late February 2020. And we continued our phase 1 interviews throughout the summer of 2020. So there was a lot going on during that time, and many of the global and local concerns were making their way into our interviews and our conversations. So I'm just going to share a couple of specific examples I thought were interesting of how the pandemic and the racial reckonings influenced the work. And then I'm sure the panel is going to have a lot more to say on the topic. So one example, we studied one institution that convened sort of a COVID action group, which was basically the cabinet plus several leaders, 1 or 2 levels down in the hierarchy. So one person they added to the group was the head of facilities, who had an integral role to play as the campus shut down, just navigating getting students off campus, but also thinking about who had nowhere else to go and how to help students who needed to stay, working with the library and dining and other important spaces on campus to and also trying to navigate the concerns and the needs of staff and faculty. With the reality that for this group of students, campus was their only home. So this person's perspective became really important in navigating some of these equity issues arising in this most crisis of crisis moments. And now they're a permanent part of this group, which has evolved into sort of a brain trust group that meets regularly. And this facilities person has really unique insights to share about equity in facilities and how physical space can contribute to feelings of inclusion or exclusion for students and for staff and faculty as well. And so these are perspectives that weren't really being considered before, but now are changing the conversations that are happening about how leadership is shared and constructed, but also how equity is conceptualized and just the role of physical space in those conversations. Another example we heard, and this one's kind of small, but from leaders across many different campuses, was about Zoom. So as much Zoom fatigue as we all have at this point, we heard that it actually played a role in breaking down hierarchies and getting more people involved in equity leadership and in professional development for DEI related issues for a few reasons. It's less of a commitment than showing up somewhere in person. You can even turn your screen off. You can type questions in the chat instead of asking them out loud. And also the squares or rectangles are all the same size and put in a grid, unless you're pinned like I am right now. But the structure of Zoom itself actually served as an equalizer for many people and helped facilitate broader participation and shared equity leadership. And this is kind of spilled over now or transitioned back into, I should say persisted actually, now that people are moving back into in-person on-campus environments. And finally, one last thing, we talked to leaders about their reflections on the protests that arose after the murder of George Floyd and the broader racial reckoning in the summer of 2020. And many leaders talked about using that moment as an opportunity to either radically rethink or reimagine new systems or ways of operating with an equity lens at the forefront. So a couple examples we heard were campuses that developed a set of guiding questions to help them consider every decision they were making through a racial equity lens. Others talked about institutionalizing what they had originally conceived as temporary changes to student support processes. And others talked about how they were finally able to get buy-in from the board or from resistant people on campus to either trying or making permanent some of the things that they had tried during the pandemic. So as I wrap things up and we transition to the panel discussion and the breakout sessions, I did want to just briefly summarize what's coming next for our Shared Equity Leadership Research Group. So I touched on a couple of these things throughout my talk, but we did recently release a second report on how to structure or organize shared equity leadership work with 4 different models for whole institution organization of the work. There's also a webinar we did on that topic that I believe is available as a recording on the ACE website if you're interested. And then we're working on 3 additional reports and a couple of briefs to be released later this year. So one on people's roles, which I mentioned, and how they're able to lean into different aspects of the model based on their roles in the institution or the hierarchy. One on rethinking accountability systems for shared work and how to distribute responsibility in ways that are effective and fair. One on capacity building for doing the work. One on the emotional labor involved in the work. And then a few more topics that were still in the earlier phases of exploration and analysis, like context and how institutional context shapes the ways that campuses approach the work, and how individual leaders' identities shape how they engage in shared equity leadership work. And then we're also working on some tools and resources to help make this more action-oriented that practitioners can take and use at their own institutions. So there's a lot more to come, and I just want to thank you all again for the opportunity to share our work. And I'm really looking forward to engaging and learning from you all throughout the rest of this convening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, or shall I say Dr. Holcomb. We really appreciate you providing this keynote on shared equity leadership today. The research, as you mentioned, authored by Dr. Adriana Kizar and by you and others, introduces an important concept in leadership that can assist senior leaders in increasing equity-focused knowledge, in our consciousness, and in our commitment, in coalescing around shared equity-focused values, and then in establishing equity-based practices on our respective campuses that result in values-based action toward impact. There's perhaps no better context for considering ways to apply the shared equity leadership model to inequities on our campuses, or to share the institutional learning, actions, and responses to equity-related matters, than the reality that we as leaders, our teams and our colleagues and all members of our campus communities, students, staff, faculty, and administrators have lived and navigated through during the period from March 2020, when the onset of COVID-19 began impacting campuses nationally and globally, until now. COVID-19 and our nation's racial reckoning combined became the catalyst to accelerate our focused attention on addressing equity-related needs.